Hello, everyone. My name is Vamsi Kanuri. I'm an associate professor of marketing at the University of Notre Dame. Today, I'm going to be presenting an Excel-based app tutorial as part of Journal of Marketing Special Issue Marketing Impact with Research-Driven Apps. For this tutorial, I'm going to be presenting one of my recent Journal of Marketing papers titled Scheduling Content on Social Media, Model, Evidence, and Application. This is joint work with Yixing Chen, my colleague at the University of Notre Dame, and Hari Sridhar, who's the current EIC of the Journal of Marketing and who's at Texas A&M University. For this project, we've collaborated with the Reynolds Journalism Institute at the University of Missouri to obtain data. As part of the collaboration, we worked with one of the top newspapers in the United States. It would be helpful to actually understand the state of the newspapers back then and why the collaborating newspaper wanted us to study content scheduling on social media and how we went about solving that problem. So to start off, like many newspapers in the country at that time, our collaborating newspaper was also facing several challenges related to revenues. Primarily, the revenue streams, both print and online revenues, were declining, primarily because of the reader migration to digital news sources and also free and competing news sources online. And when this news broke out to the advertisers, they also started migrating to other sources. So it was sort of a double whammy effect for newspapers, where the newspapers took a hit on both circulation as well as advertising revenues. Now, when our collaborating firm was going through this problem, they wanted to figure out ways to curtail the decline in revenues, and they were trying to come up with strategies to improve their print, their offline and online revenues. And as part of their effort to improve their digital advertising revenues, one of the avenues they wanted to focus was their social media page. That is, how to strategically post content to drive traffic to their website, which then will result in an increase in digital advertising revenue. Let me further explain that on the next slide. For this illustration, I'm going to use the New York Times. It is not the newspaper we collaborated with, but our collaborating firm functions very similarly to New York Times, especially when it comes to the social media strategy. Most newspapers have a social media presence, and especially a dedicated social media page. So this is a dedicated social media page of New York Times on Facebook. And newspapers use their page to promote content, the stories they write. They selectively pick different stories and post them. The idea is that when they post these stories, the followers of this page, that is the people that liked this page, the dedicated page on a social media platform, organically get this information, and that will boost interest in the newspaper's content, which then will encourage them to engage with the post, and which will then drive traffic to the newspaper's website, and eventually that traffic will generate digital advertising revenue. Specifically, when by the way, not every engagement metric actually generates revenue for a newspaper. For example, when someone likes or comments, that in and of itself doesn't generate any revenue. That could have the after effects, which could generate revenue, but we are not going to be looking at those after effects, that is the analogous to the word of mouth effects. But we are looking at direct interaction with content and how that can change, that can drive digital advertising revenue directly from the user that interacted with the post. So when a user clicks on the story, that is an engagement metric that actually generates money, because the user is then redirected to the newspaper's webpage that hosts several ads. So for example, this newspaper, New York Times page that you see here has an Audi ad that I'm sure is paying New York Times for every impression that the New York Times generates for Audi. So given the setup, our collaborating firm really wanted to understand if they can do things differently on its dedicated social media page, that is, in terms of posting content or scheduling content that can then drive up organic reach, which is the number of fans that actually directly get to see the story, and which then affects the likelihood of, that increases the likelihoods of link clicks, which then drives more traffic to the firm's web pages and which then generates more advertising revenue. Just to give you a sense of, how complex scheduling is on social media, or how many moving parts that social media managers can deal with, here's a sample schedule that our collaborating firm followed on the 10th of January in 2016. This was about the time when we started collaborating with the firm. As you can see, there's several moving parts. It can choose what time to post the story, and how long to wait before they post the next story, which we call interpost duration, and how much to spend money promoting the stories. So sometimes firms can actually selectively choose stories that they've posted on their dedicated page to promote. For example, if there's a big investigative piece and the newspaper wants that story to reach outside of the followers and have a broader reach, the newspaper can pay Facebook and pick the target demographics and can boost the organic reach, which then has downstream consequences, as we saw on the previous slide. So we call this targeted content promotion. So the New York Times in the example, or collaborating firm, can choose which stories to boost, and also can pick which content categories, stories within different content categories to post on social media. So there are quite a few decision variables available for social media managers, and hence our questions were that we wanted to focus were, when should social media managers really post their content if they have, let's say, 8 stories that they wanted to post on their social media on a given day, when to post those stories, how frequently to post those stories, which story to boost. And the last one is an optimization question: how many stories to boost given the boosting budget, which happens to be a resource allocation question. But we didn't want to just study these questions within the context of the social media of the firm, collaborating firm. But we wanted to ground these or find answers based on how users engage with content. So what do users prefer? Which types of content do users prefer? What times of the day are users more receptive to certain content, and how their content engagement changes over time. So we wanted to fundamentally build a conceptual framework that's grounded in consumer psychology, and then test that framework using data from this firm. So and really test the hypotheses on how content timing, interpost duration, and targeted content advertising affect content engagement, specifically organic reach and link clicks. And then our second question was more of a normative model. We wanted to come up with a normative framework which the firm could then use in conjunction with our econometric model or predictive model to really identify a posting schedule. And For that, one of the requirements of the social media manager was that we create an interactive decision support tool, which the manager can then, go in and really see how these look under the hood, if you will, just to see how different parts actually are connected. Because if things change in the future, the social media manager wanted access to the actual formulas and the inner workings of the decision tool, so they could then go and adapt the tool to meet their needs. And we also wanted to use, develop a tool to test several scenarios. Towards the end of the presentation, you'll see what I mean by that. But we wanted to understand how firms' profits changes under different conditions. So, if you will, there are counterfactuals, what if scenarios where a firm can evaluate, different outcomes based on the input settings. With that said, this is how our conceptual framework looks. On the left-hand side, you'll see the key scheduling attributes, the three key scheduling attributes, which impact organic reach, which then impact link clicks. They're both in some ways manifested at the same time. This we refer to as social media post performance, and link clicks drive the gross advertising profits for the newspaper. We use the first two boxes to develop our econometric model, and then we use the input from the econometric model to develop our optimization model, which will then, or normative framework, which will then operationalize or implement in Excel. Our econometric model comprised of two equations. These are contemporaneous equations. In the interest of this presentation, I'll not delve too deep into the model itself. For an interested reader, we dive deep into this model and also talk about several key estimation challenges that we had to overcome in order to tease out some sort of unbiased association between our key scheduling variables and engagement. We addressed endogeneity problems. We talk about unobserved heterogeneity at length in the paper. So for an interested reader, I strongly encourage you to refer to our 2018 Journal of Marketing paper. This is a bit more context about the newspaper. It's a top, at least at that time, it was a top 50 US newspaper. It had a daily print circulation of about 230,000 readers, and a Sunday circulation of about 336,000 paid users. It was getting about 43 million page views per month, which was right about in the range of the top newspapers in the country. And the newspaper's readers comprised of educated, affluent readers who were on the move. It reached, as you can see, it reached majority of the adults in two of the biggest counties in the state. It was a major newspaper. In some ways, it was a monopolist. It had smaller competitors, but this was the biggest newspaper in that state. For the sake of our empirical application, we obtained every single story that was posted between the 1st of January 2015 and the 31st of December 2015. And we used this data to calibrate those two predictive models. And then we use those models first to test our hypotheses on the key scheduling attributes, and then use those predictive models in our normative framework. So to ensure that those models had good predictive validity, we had a holdout sample, ensured, the out of model fit was good, and the errors were minimal. Although I must say, this is the scheduler or Excel-based app we're going to show is somewhat static. I'll talk about it when we get to the Excel-based app. But I think it's time to move on to the normative analysis. The goal of the normative analysis is to really maximize gross advertising revenues, or in some sense, gross profits for the newspaper. Now, the objective function comprised of a revenue component, which came from all of the clicks that news stories generated across different content categories. And there's also an advertising cost on Facebook. So this is the cost that newspapers bear because they boost certain content. Now, the objective function this problem turns out to be a complex combinatorial optimization problem, not because it's multidimensional or nonlinear. It is complex because it is a discrete continuous problem with gross profits changing not only with content categories, which is the X dimension in this matrix, but also time slots, which is the J dimension in this matrix. So you can think of this as a schedule or a timetable for posting stories within each content category. For the sake of this empirical exercise, newspaper classified all of its news stories, at least the ones that it posted on social media, into 7 categories: local, business, sports, entertainment, living, editorial, and national. And contingent on whether a specific slot had a story in it or not, the newspaper could decide to boost it, which is what you see in the paid column. Contingent on the slot having a post, the newspaper could also boost, again, with the constraint that all of the money spent boosting a particular story would be less than the boosting budget. So these are the different constraints that the firm was operating under. Each column you see in the matrix, for example, within local, all of the stories had to add up to the total number of stories that the firm wanted to post in that category on a given day. And each slot had to have only one story. And the contingent on a slot having a story, the firm could actually then boost. That's the third constraint. And the total budget had to be less than the advertising budget set by the social media manager. That's the fourth constraint. And the fifth constraint is just, how these variables are operationalized. They're all operationalized as binary variables. And then we use organic reach and link click predictive models that we built in the previous stage of the project to predict the organic reach and link clicks that each slot would generate if there was a story of a certain type in that particular slot. It's a lot to take in, but to actually if you're interested in these sort of problems, I would again strongly encourage to go to the paper to read about the optimization problem. But like I said, this is a complex combinatorial optimization problem. Just to give you a sense of how complex this is, this falls into a class of problems that are called product line pricing and design problems. Even without boosting, if there are 19 slots, so between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., although I show a schedule between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m., technically this could be a 24-hour schedule, but for the sake of illustration, I'm just going to do 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., and there are 19 slots in that time frame. So for someone to post our stories in 19 slots without replacement, that's the formula. It's pretty straightforward. 19 factorial over 19 minus r factorial. And let's say the firm wanted to post 10 stories. That number would be, the total number of permutations would then be at about 336 billion, yes, with a B. So technically, one could follow a complete enumeration approach where they would evaluate every single option in these 336 billion permutations and figure out a global optimum. But certainly that comes at a cost, the cost being time and computational complexity. And another route is to find a closed form solution, but there's a lot of research, prior research in the product line space, design and pricing space, that confirms that these sort of problems are NP hard, which means that it's hard to find a closed form solution in polynomial time. So researchers usually recommend heuristic techniques to solve these problems. And there are three types of heuristic techniques in attribute space, product space, and partially formed product space. And we could also use different softwares to solve these complex optimization problems. Two of the softwares I've used in the past are Gurobi and Cplex. They're very efficient and help with solving mixed integer problems and combinatorial problems. Over time, they've become more user-friendly. So I definitely recommend you look into that. But again, resorting to those softwares would have resulted in developing a solution that is not managerially friendly. One of the goals of this research was to develop a decision support tool that would enhance usability by managers and also help managers look under the hood. So we resorted to Excel. A lot of times I know Excel is often passed up when people start thinking about developing tools, but I would strongly encourage researchers to consider Excel as an option. For one, it's widely used across all management levels. So it helps mitigate barriers for usage. And developing an Excel app certainly has enhanced usage at our collaborating firm. And moreover, it doesn't require coding. Even researchers that don't have coding experience can develop fairly impactful apps in Excel. So I highly encourage using Excel to develop your decision tools. At this time, I think it'd be helpful to actually switch to the Excel-based app we developed. This is the Excel-based app. It's fairly straightforward. It's not fancy at all. It has several inputs and then decision variables, objective function, and a whole bunch of constraints. I'll walk you through how we develop this decision tool. The first set of values that you see here are inputs to our scheduler and also to our predictive models. Our predictive models included month fixed effects and also whether or not it was a weekend. The day the stories were posted was a weekend, and we also had a time trend. So managers need to provide that information. And for our scheduler, we need a boosting budget that the manager is willing to spend on a given day. The manager also needs to tell the scheduler how many stories they want to post within each of these content categories. And for each of these content categories, what was the average revenue the firm made per click? And this information is readily available with at all newspapers and social media managers. My understanding, talking to the social media manager at our collaborating firm, is that this information is readily accessible even to social media managers. The other piece of information we need is the boosting cost per click. This is again available directly from Facebook. Facebook provides this value to admins, and we obtained it from the social media manager as well. Now, given these inputs, this is similar to the schedule, the matrix I've shown earlier. There's a bunch of zeros, ones, and zeros. Each content category adds to a certain number, and we'll have to make sure that these numbers align with the chosen content, the chosen stories in the input phase. And column K ensures that there's only one story given, in a given time slot, and column J suggests social media managers which stories to boost. And this column L computes the interpost duration, which is the distance between the previously posted story and the next story. Based on what the scheduler picks. So we're going to be using, spoiler alert, we're going to be using Solver to solve this, depending on which inputs or which time slots Solver picks. The organic reach for that time slot gets impacted, which then impacts link clicks. And depending on whether or not the solver decides to boost a particular story, it affects the boosting cost for that story. And all of this culminates into gross profits and net revenue and boosting cost. The difference between the two results in gross profits. This is our objective function. We want to maximize this objective function. So after setting up this, and as you can see, this is fairly straightforward. This doesn't need any coding, but it's really impactful because, tomorrow if the revenue per click changes, and we all know revenue per click changes because it really depends on the second price auctions that ad platforms run, and the composition of advertisers that want to advertise at the newspaper. So this can run in this sense. This is a static optimization tool, but again, this can be fairly easily adjusted by social media managers. They can also adjust the boosting cost based on what Facebook is charging per click. So all of these parameters, and as they move through the year, they can change these input parameters as well. Now, in order to for Solver to identify the optimal schedule, we need to provide the decision variable, the constraints, and also the objective function to the optimizer, to Solver. So we provide all of that. Here we start with the objective function, which is maximizing our gross profit. And by changing all of these values, which is ones and zeros, and all including whether or not a particular time slot needs to be boosted. There's a bunch of constraints. The first constraint ensures that the boosting cost is less than the boosting budget that the manager specifies here, $700 in this case. It ensures that all of these variables, it tells Solver that all of these variables are binary. That's the second constraint. In the third constraint, we ensure that the total number of stories picked within a content category matches the numbers that are the inputs that are provided by the social media manager in row 10. The next constraint ensures that the solver only boosts a post if a content category has been chosen in a given time slot. And the last constraint ensures that there's only one story within a time slot. Then we could have picked, there are several options to solve this problem. We picked evolutionary because of first of all, it's a nonlinear problem, so you can't pick simplex. But between the nonlinear, GRG nonlinear, and evolutionary is supposed to be more elaborate, and it's based on the genetic algorithm, which is a bit more exhaustive than GRG nonlinear. And the downside, though, is that it takes a little bit longer to actually find the solution. And for that reason, I'm not going to solve it right now. But rest assured, the solution that you're seeing here is the solution that Solver converged on. As you can see, again, this is a fairly straightforward. It did take a little bit of thinking to bring all of the pieces together, but it's not nearly as complex as developing a new deep learning algorithm or figuring out or coding all of this up in Gurobi or Cplex. Then what we wanted to do was use this solver decision tool ourselves and test what the the optimal profit would be under different scenarios. So let me switch to the presentation mode here. The first condition was we wanted to test what the maximum the gross profits would look like when managers didn't have any boosting budget. So the boosting budget was set to 0, and we asked the decision tool to actually the solver to spit out a schedule, and this is the proposed schedule you see on the right-hand side. This was the current schedule that the firm followed. So obviously this was the holdout sample. So we're comparing our schedule to the current schedule. As you can see, even without any boosting budget, the firm, the solver suggested a schedule that would have resulted in 22.75% higher profits. If the second scenario was, what if the firm wanted to maximize reach and not link clicks or advertising revenue, and without any boosting? And this would be a scenario where the firm is trying to maximize its reach, develop interests as part of its brand building efforts, and it's not overly focused on bringing in more ad revenue. In this case, the objective was to maximize organic reach and not link clicks. So in this case, as you can see, this is another proposed schedule, which looks a little different from the previous schedule. And even in this case, the algorithm, the suggested schedule would have generated 15% more profits than the baseline scenario. Finally, what if the firm promotes some of these posts? So we allowed for some boosting budget. We ran several scenarios here. You'll see 2 scenarios where the boosting budget was $500 and the boosting budget was $700. And in the first case, the algorithm suggested that 1, 2, 3, 4 posts be boosted. And the second case, the algorithm suggested 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 posts to be boosted. In both cases, the profits actually increased tremendously. And this led us to think about, what is the optimal boosting budget? Do profits constantly increase with boosting budget? We ran our algorithm under several conditions, starting with $100 to $700. As you can see, a concave curve is realized. So what we know about the effect of advertising on profits is nonlinear and especially concave with diminishing returns. We actually realized that with targeted content advertising as well. And we did not solve that problem. We just wanted to show the pattern. We wanted to understand the pattern, and the pattern does look like what research has suggested in the past. Overall, I want to conclude with that slide. But overall, I got to tell you that the decision support tool that we developed was most impactful. Our social media manager started using the decision support tool and was really helpful to communicate to the upper management why they have to consider they have to strategically post. And the beauty about all of this is our research suggests that they don't have to do anything new that would require more effort or time. They just have to take their existing schedules and think strategically about posting the content at different time slots or spacing out the content and posting certain types of content in the morning, because this was based on consumer behavior. This is how consumers like. So understanding consumer behavior and then building a predictive model and then a normative model, a decision support tool based on all of this, certainly helped managers convince that this is the way to go. So I'm sure the special issue editors would love your work. based on the work that actually comes up with a decision support tool. So I would strongly encourage all of you to start thinking about using Excel to develop simple apps that will further the impact, managerial impact of your research. And good luck, everyone. Thank you so much.